Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to our 32nd episode of Islamicate book reviews with myself, al-Azami, and our voracious reader, Dr. Omar Anchassi, zooming in from Riyadh at the King Faisal Center and a research fellow at the University of Exeter at the same time. Welcome, Omar, and welcome to our viewers. Omar, you're going to be discussing this week, inshallah, a book by Sevgi Adak at the Ismaili Institute, if I recall correctly. And her
I think
book
it's joined with at Aga Khan University there.
Okay.
In the same building, but distinct institutions, I understand.
Right. And her book is entitled Anti-Veiling Campaigns in Turkey, State, Society, and Gender in the Early Republic. So as per usual, the format will be, Omar, you'll be presenting the book in, I guess, 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll launch into a discussion. And we welcome questions from any sort of audience members who may be interested in asking questions. And inshallah, we'll try and address those in the last half hour or so of our discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to yourself, Omar, and you can take it forward.
Thanks, Osama. This is a very fascinating book, not least because of my own long-standing interest in veiling and veiling practices and how these become transformed in the modern world. This book is divided or is comprised of an introduction and 5 body chapters, exploring respectively the late Ottoman debate and early attempts to discourage veiling in early Republican Turkey, largely in the second half of the 1920s. And the second chapter explores the kind of crest, if you like, of this movement, especially in the mid-1930s onwards, this kind of major wave of largely local and not nationally coordinated attempts to discourage veiling, occasionally to suppress it through use of fines, and occasionally coercion in other forms, the use of gendarmes and even police to suppress the veils. And of course, the nature of veiling practices is richly varied, and in different contexts within even Turkey itself, you find different garments. Some local attempts to discourage veiling targeted specific garments, and in some cases, these were preceded by attempts to change men's dress, something I'll have to revisit. Especially significant in this importance is the 1925 hat law, which forbade the wearing of the fez and other headgear, at least by people who aren't religious professionals, including groups other than Muslims, incidentally. The third chapter explores local elites and their attempts to operationalize these anti-veiling campaigns, and also in some cases their resistance. And it also reflects a more sustained length on the complicated question of so-called center-periphery relations, which is one of the major themes preoccupying the author. Again, a theme I'll unpack when I return to discuss the book's contents in more detail. And the fourth chapter, exploring women and their reception, negotiation, and contestation, and in some cases adoption of these anti-veiling measures. There were, of course, some female activists who actively supported these anti-veiling campaigns, but Adak also reports a rich repertoire of resistance taking many forms, though one should note the resistance was not coordinated, and it took spontaneous and widely varied forms. And finally, an especially interesting chapter on Turkish anti-veiling campaigns in the context of the wider Muslim world, particularly Iran and Albania, although developments in Arab countries and even elsewhere are discussed as well. So I should begin by saying that if you look at the secondary literature, you don't always get a straight story, or you read contradictory reports on whether or not veiling was actually banned in Republican Turkey. And two texts that have really shaped more than a generation of students' reading of the transformation of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the Republic, mentioned by Adak, are Bernard Lewis's classic 1961 study, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, and Niyazi Berkes's 1964 study, The Development of Secularism in Turkey. I should say, though important, these studies have now really been superseded by more nuanced accounts of, for want of a better term, modernization in the Ottoman and early Republican contexts. The works, for example, of Carter von Findley and others. So, new generations of scholars, though they are in important respects indebted to Berkes and Lewis, and may even cut their teeth on that kind of scholarship, hopefully have transcended that kind of discourse that really depicted in very dichotomous, even Manichaean fashion, the struggle of a modernizing elite against backward, rural, pious, unenlightened masses. And it was no secret in the case of Berkes and Lewis where their sympathies lay. A trend that, by the way, still persists in much scholarship on the early Republican period. I mean, if you read, for instance, the scholar Andrew Mango's biography of Ataturk, he makes no secret about where his sympathies lie. And again, it says, opposition to Kemal and his project, is the domain of unenlightened conservatives, essentially. So, and of course, in the Turkish context itself, these narratives still shape the historiography in important ways. I should say yeah.
The three titles that you would mention in particular: Lewis's Emergence of Modern Turkey, Niyazi Berkes's what's the title of this book? And then
the development of secularism in modern Turkey, something along these lines. I didn't mention the title of Findley's work. It's not mentioned in, or that particular book isn't mentioned here, but it's something like State, something in Nation. I forget, honestly. Now,
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so Carter von Findley in his work broadly, not just in that book, discusses, or his contention rather is, what you had in the late Ottoman and early Republican context is not in fact a contest between unenlightened reactionaries and secularizing elites. What you actually had was two competing versions, or visions, I should say, of modernization, one of which triumphed, through the use of state power and the suppression of the alternatives. And scholarship on the Ottoman Empire and early Republic increasingly, whatever domain you're looking at, whether it's intellectual life or, bureaucratic apparatus, and even courts and the legal system, recent scholarship really has stressed the great degree of continuity between the late Empire and the early Republic. And this is the case, again, as I said, across the board. So, I mean, Amit Bain, in his fascinating work on ulama in the late Empire and early Republic, amusingly, points out the extent to which not only did you have a great degree of continuity in terms of personnel, you can't somehow vanish a massive body of religious elites and recreate it from scratch overnight, especially when institutions for training these personnel already exist. But the early Republic seriously distrusted its own religious personnel and, in fact, its own Ministry of Endowments and the Diyanet. which is fascinating. And this is partly because of the kinds of intellectual continuity and continuities in terms of personnel one finds between the late Empire and the early Republic. And Adak herself in the book emphasizes in the 5th chapter, the comparative one, the extent to which, unlike Iran and even more so perhaps Albania, where the modern state is basically a 20th century creature, in Turkey you already had, and following on from the Ottoman Empire, it was already a fairly highly centralized, bureaucracy and state machinery and apparatus. Although, ironically, or perhaps counter to one's expectations, Adak emphasizes throughout the extent to which the relationship, if you like, between center and periphery in the Turkish context was a complex one. And although the central government did occasionally issue circulars, as in 1934, on anti-veiling campaigns, and they were very concerned that local government not adopt coercive measures, and they emphasized instead the importance of propaganda. Nonetheless, their guidance was often unclear and even to some extent ambivalent. So local agents had great scope for action and for shaping these campaigns, and often exceeded their brief. I mean, as I said previously, you had cases of gendarmes and local police being employed to forcibly remove women's veils. And partly the anxiety of central government was due to the extremely negative reaction to the 1925 Hat Law, which banned the use of headgear such as fezzes and turbans and so on. And this has nothing to do with a concern for people's well-being or rights, because Adak notes in, I believe, the 2nd and especially 3rd chapters, the kind of high Kemalism of the 1930s, beginning especially from the Republican People's Party Congress in 1931. You had an increasing turn towards statism and authoritarianism, partly a reaction to the Great Depression, of course, and the need for greater state support for industry, for example. But Adak tells us that the kind of crest of these anti-veiling campaigns, I think the first one beginning in 1933 in August, and then 1934 and 1935 ramping up with bans of particular garments. These are kind of part of a wider program of changes, including the 1934 surname law and clothing law of 1934 that prohibited religious professionals from wearing their garments, the distinctive religious garments, outside of the context of services. So I should say something more just to set the context about the 1st chapter, because I've talked about the kind of crest of reforms in the mid-1930s in particular. But
do you want to give an overview of the book in the next 5 minutes or so, inshallah?
Sure. I mean, I've already discussed each of the chapters individually, but I'll kind of set the scene, if you like. And I should say, in terms of important publications on this subject discussed by the author, among other items, you have the very important book on anti-veiling initiatives in the Muslim world, edited by Stephanie Cronin, in which there are 3 chapters on the Republican Turkish experiment, and a book that I actually read, having encountered references to it in James Pickett's book, on which we had our 2nd episode, Marianne Kamp's 2006, The New Woman in Uzbekistan, which is an outstanding work exploring anti-veiling campaigns in the context of the Soviet Republic there in 1927 with the so-called hujum, this kind of very fierce anti-veiling campaign And there are, the Uzbek case is distinctive in important ways, partly because you had something you don't see, as far as I know, elsewhere in the Muslim majority world camp, says large numbers of women killed for unveiling in the region of 2,500, I believe, over a number of years. Of course, you do have incidents of violence, even in the Turkish context, cases of harassment, alleged death threats to local governors, but it seems fairly limited. I mean, there are cases of harassment and assault, but these were, central government directed local councils and governors to punish these. And generally speaking, they seem to have been sporadic in contexts like Turkey.
Just a clarification. So Marian Camp talks about, in the sort of Uzbek case, the killing of women by governments because the women were defying orders to unveil, or the reverse?
No, the reverse.
Oh, wow.
Sorry that wasn't clear. The reverse. The killing of women for unveiling. Because in the Uzbek context, all of these scholars are trying to stress women's agency and their repertoire of resistance. But of course, there were women who enthusiastically embraced and supported these changes. Right. And other women who are, in a sense, between a rock and a hard place, right. Confronted by, the state's, sometimes even coercive measures, and the attitudes of their peers and their families. And to some extent, this is responsible. I mean, I do want to stress, as Adak rightly does, the importance of women's agency and the negotiation and contestation of the anti-veiling campaign, especially in the Turkish context, which is our concern here. So, for instance, I haven't even discussed, I should say, and perhaps we could lengthen the episode a bit, because the more I discuss it, the more I realize there is more to be said.
More than welcome to.
Yeah. So, what are we actually talking about when we talk about veiling? That's a fundamental question. So, across the Muslim majority world, certainly in urban spaces and among middle and upper class women, and even to some extent lower classes, in cities in the early 20th century, women, respectable women at least, veiled their faces. They may cover their faces entirely. They may leave a slit or something like that. Or they may wear a translucent veil over the lower halves of their faces. The practice of veiling is richly varied. However, the expectation, very much in line with post-classical legal norms in Islamic legal works, the expectation was that women veil their faces. And I should stress, this development in terms of Islamic law is not solely post-classical, and from fairly early on, including among Sunni schools other than the Hanbalis, for whom this always seems to have been the norm or the standard legal view, as far as one can tell. Imam Ahmed, for example, in his Masail, is reported to have said of slave woman, إذا كانت جميلة تنتقب. Right, so this is slave woman, let alone free woman. Now, in other early works, and this isn't something discussed in Adak, who does refer occasionally to the views of modernist religious intellectuals and even muftis, but does not actually explore the legal literature directly herself. So in my own
this point about this position of Ahmed, is this discussed in the secondary literature?
Well, it's referred to in my article in Islamic Law and Society. So I suppose the short answer is yes. Insofar as I've contributed to secondary literature to plug my own work. So anyway, something I didn't entirely kind of explore in that article, sorry to be so self-indulgent, is I mean, even in fairly early works, so, long before the post-classical period, say Joanny, and authors like al-Joanny, I mean, it seems to be just taken for granted that women are covering their faces. And in fact, as I mentioned again in the article, we have a Chinese prisoner of war account reporting his experiences in Iraq in approximately in the second half of the second Islamic century, so very early on, predating most of our legal works. This has been translated in its entirety, in fact, by the one of the journals of the King Faisal Center, I think Dirasat, maybe. And in fact, Robert Hoyland first alluded to it in his Seeing Islam as Other Soil. So anyway, he's interested in it for reasons of Islamic origins, but this prisoner who travels or spends time several years in Iraq says very clearly that women cover their faces when they go outside. So in terms of practice, we know for sure, and this is is not a later projection. This is a source from the mid-2nd century, and I think he goes to Kufa. I'm not sure if he goes to Baghdad or if Baghdad has been founded when he's there. But in any case, so in terms of practice, we know this was certainly the case, and veiling of the face, of course, is not novel even in the context of Western Arabia. You find references to it in Jahili poetry and even in sources in the early Common Era, including, I think, the church father Tertullian. I'm never sure how to pronounce that, so that's how it sounds, but sorry, that's how the word looks, but that's not in fact how it's pronounced. And others who curiously say things like, and cited in my article, sorry to keep plugging my article, but it's relevant here, that women would leave one eye uncovered so they could see. Of course, anyone familiar with early tafsir knows you find exactly the same material in early tafsir, like Tabari, for instance. In any case, what does veiling mean in the late Ottoman Empire? It means the wearing of a garment that had become popular, seemingly adopted from the Arab world, Adak suggests, in the 19th century, the sharshaf, which is a kind of garment that covers the head and presumably the upper body, and it's like the word for bedsheet. It's just a single piece of cloth that you can wrap around yourself and fasten as you like. And also, the other relevant item of clothing in this context is the pecha, which is a face veil, right, that covers at least the lower half of the face. Now, one thing that must be stressed, and that Adak stresses repeatedly, is that anti-veiling campaigns in Turkey never targeted covering of the hair. They never targeted covering of the hair. And Ataturk himself, alayhi min Allahi ma yastahiq, never spoke against covering of the hair. Now, this is very interesting. And the first item, if you like, to be relinquished was the face veil or pecha. And the sharshaf, some bans, by the way, targeted the pecha and not the sharshaf. Some targeted both. The pecha persisted. The sharshaf persisted to a much greater extent. And even those who relinquished the pecha could find ways of evading the prohibition. As for instance, the report of Aisha radiallahu anha on Hajj, and it comes to mind since I was recently on Hajj, of course, that in Islamic legal texts, women are generally prohibited from veiling their faces while on Hajj based on a hadith. However, in a report attributed to Aisha, she says, we would kind of hang the cloth loosely on our heads, and when strange men would pass by, we would simply cover our faces. So when I went on Hajj recently with a Saudi tour group, I mean, the great majority of the women simply had their faces covered at all times, as they're always in the presence of foreign men or strange men. Just an interesting note here, there. So the targeting of, the covering of hair was never actually targeted in these reforms, although, of course, the ideal new woman envisioned by the Republican elite was one who dressed like Europeans. And Adak notes the greatest compliment an elite, woman of the elite could receive in this early Republican period was the suggestion that she looked like a foreign woman. So great was the extent of these persons' self-hatred, basically. There's no other way to discuss it. And this period of the 1920s and 30s is just the nadir of Muslim dignity and self-respect. And one is reminded of the speeches of Malcolm X.
Let me interject there briefly. I mean, I get the impression that this kind of an attitude is still to be found in places like South Asia. I lived in South Asia in the 90s for a couple of years, and I got a sense that saying someone looked like a foreigner would have been a compliment, because the assumption, or looked like a European or a Westerner or something like that. Because
yeah, I mean, that could potentially be about skin tone and colorism and shadism and so on to some extent. And that dynamic is also at play, of course, in the Turkish context. However, for instance, Adak mentions in 1929, Turkey holds its first beauty pageant, and it's considered a moment of great national triumph when in 1932, Miss Turkey enjoys the dubious honor of becoming Miss World. Now, of course, there's a very well-developed feminist critique of the inanity that is the beauty pageant. I mean, essentially the underlying philosophy is that women are, pieces of meat to be looked at and, to be compared and so on. I mean, I can't understand how anyone in their right mind would not find such things extremely demeaning. But there you go. That's the Muslim majority world in the early 20th century. And
I can't imagine a great deal of people beyond elite circles would have seen it with favor.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. Now, that's certainly the case in the 1920s in the Turkish context, because we have our very first highly localized and not very widespread attempts to campaign against veiling, particularly the petsa, the face veil, largely kind of tied to the 1925 hat law and following closely in its wake, beginning, I think, in 1926 in Trabzon, with an attempt to, with a ban directly on the petsa itself. Now, throughout this period, the 1920s and 30s, local newspapers always exaggerate the extent to which these measures had been enthusiastically embraced by local women, and always did their best to downplay the extent of resistance. And if they didn't downplay the extent, they could attribute to other causes, like their menfolk are forcing them to continue wearing it. And in some cases, I'm sure that was true. But women also, into the 1930s, adopted, as I said, these creative strategies of resistance. In Riza, they even had to prohibit women from carrying umbrellas, because when men went by, they would open their umbrellas to conceal their faces from them. Some would wear loose shershefs that they could simply drape over their faces when the need arose. So again, a rich repertoire of resistance. Now, although one should stress, and following Adak, I should say very briefly, her major sources are both newspapers, of course, very important. She draws on, I think, 12 different newspapers from eight provinces, as well as police and government archives, and very interestingly, British and American consular reports. Because the philosophy animating early Republican Turkey, of course, is a very kind of partisan characterization, but that's what people who watch me speak get. Because the philosophy animating the early Turkish Republic was very much monkey see, monkey do. the Republican elite really expressed very profound anxiety about how Europeans viewed them and how they reported on the success of anti-veiling campaigns. And, you always have, and there's still very much with us, of course, a kind of internal and internalized Orientalism in the Muslim majority world, whereby white, quote unquote, Republican elites in coastal cities like Istanbul and Izmir and the capital, of course, administrative capital, Ankara, view their own, not citizens, because Turkey until the mid-20th century is not a Republican regime in the sense of participatory democracy. It's an authoritarian state, so it's better to speak of Turkish people as subjects in the first half of the 20th century, in my opinion, and especially following this increasingly authoritarian turn in the beginning of approximately 1931. In any case, sorry, my train of thought was lost by that.
Sorry,
brief.
You were talking about. Yeah, sorry, you were talking about the way in which certain kind of European ideals or perceptions were seen as a guide to how Turks should behave.
Very good. So, Republican elites look down on their own countrymen as backward, as Oriental. And I mean, one of the most delicious ironies of the anti-veiling campaigns, delicious or disgusting, I mean, in one sense, probably both at the same time, is the way that the sharshaf and the face veil were denounced as foreign and un-Turkish in the same breath when Republican elites were encouraging women to adopt European overcoats. Now, Adak also mentions the extent to which non-cooperation was partly just economic, a function of means. The fact that the sharshaf and veils were produced locally and inexpensively versus European overcoats, which were sometimes, especially in the provinces, difficult to obtain and very expensive. The same is also true of hats, incidentally. Now, it's entirely disingenuous to suggest that veiling is somehow foreign to the Turkish character, though Turkish women had been veiling for many, many centuries, but at the same time urge them to adopt European dress.
Right.
I mean, as I said,
So if I can briefly interject, so basically there's kind of an ideological transformation attempted as to be engineered here, in which true Turkishness is about being modern and at the forefront of the world, and that's being the vanguard for that is Europe, and so true Turkish, it's an ideological project, obviously. True Turkishness is to be like, and that stuff is alien and foreign. And I mean, you'd know this a lot better than me, but would there have been deeply embedded within this a kind of an argument, maybe not made explicitly, that Islam that came to our, came from the Arabs to us, is basically too freighted with Arab culture, and we need to dilute it in the way that Europeans have diluted their Christianity into something which is overpowered.
I would nuance that slightly by actually mentioning the very first book on which we had an episode where, because we were still figuring out the format, I didn't really get as granular as I subsequently would have liked. But there's a very fine account of, there's a particular technical term in Turkish that Kevin Reinhardt uses, himself being literate in that language, having lived there in his childhood. But basically, the Turkish National Project, or the Turkish-Islam synthesis, that's what it's called. And there's a Turkish equivalent. The Turkish-Islam synthesis, articulated largely in the early Republican period and emerging, with even greater force in the 1980s and so on. The Turkish-Islam synthesis instrumentalized Islam, and in many senses, it was never not the case that Islam was a vital aspect of Turkish identity. There's no way you can discard that. And, some scholars have even noted the extent to which, people of Sunni background, even if it's only nominally, were kind of privileged in the Republican Party, even though this is a kind of secular laicist party. You know, you still had this dynamic, almost sectarian dynamic going on, which is amusing at the extreme. But anyway, the Turkish Islams, and in this respect, it's no different from the nationalist claptrap you find emanating from all parts of the non-Arab world. You know, you have a number of stances, whether it's in Iran or North Africa among Berbers, or South Asia or Central Asia, and you know, the list goes on. You know, this notion either that Islam is bad because it's a foreign Arab imposition, or the more common view of nationalists, which is that Islam is a part of our national heritage. So this kind of instrumentalization going on, this parochialization of Islam is just an element in a larger identity that transcends Islam. And I have so many complaints against this. I mean, this episode, if you don't stop me, Osama, will get very ranty, because honestly, what great heritage is there for the Turks to celebrate before the Ottoman Empire, an empire that was one of the greatest in the world and straddled 3 continents, compared to the inflation-ridden wreck of, you know, the 1990s, you know, fourth-rate power that deserves the respect of nobody. Anyway, you can decide which is more deserving of Turkish pride.
I mean,
but in any case,
let's try and focus.
Okay. In any case, sorry, you know, it's anyway. In any case, so again, you hear this other version as articulated in the Turkish Islam synthesis that, well, actually, it's the Turks who manifest true Islam, and you know, the Arabs, you know, extreme, or they misunderstand the religion in various ways. Of course, this dynamic happens in the Arab world, and you feel sorry for the Saudis, because the kind of blame is ultimately referred to them. You know, whether it's Egypt or Syria, our Islam is moderate, it's the Saudis who get things wrong. And then you have this dynamic even within Saudi society itself, but that's another story. Anyway, now, generally in terms of veiling, you know, of course, the Ottoman Empire, long before the modern period, Adak cites examples from, for example, the 18th century. You had sumptuary laws regulating the thickness and length of women's clothing. And in the 19th century itself, you know, in the 1870s, for instance, you have attempts to limit the thinness and transparency and tightness or tautness of women's outer garments. You did actually have some suspicion of the Shershaf in official Ottoman circles, including Abdulhamid II himself. I think largely because of security concerns. He was worried that people were using it to conceal their identities. Fairly well known for his, I mean, it's often characterized as paranoia, but as Sherman Jackson has said on more than one occasion, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean someone isn't following you. And I think there were good reasons for his paranoia. This, you know, but in any case, so you had.
With respect to what you're talking about, the sumptuary laws and the regulation of thinness or tightness of clothing. So this is within the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and once again, is this discussed
prior to the 19th century? Prior to the 19th century as well.
Discussed in the literature? Is it discussed by Adak, incidentally?
Or? Yeah. So I should say, you know, women's dress, at least before the 19th century, was in no sense the exclusive target of sumptuary laws. You know, the idea was that dress should reflect social status. You know, in the same way that you could say among the Romans, I don't know, commoners were not allowed to wear the imperial purple, for example. I mean, sumptuary laws are very much the norm in history, not the exception. And I mean, even in various Islamicate contexts, of course, from an early period, no later than the end of the 1st century, shall we say. I mean, you know, according to the important book on this subject, whose author's name escapes me at the moment. Anyway, Milka Levy Rubin, that's it. Milka Levy Rubin, who looks at surrender agreements and Dhimma pacts and so on, who kind of tends to attribute these to Omar bin Abdulaziz rather than Omar the First ibn al-Khattab. Anyway, so you have sumptuary regulations in Muslim societies, into the 19th and in many cases, well, even into the 20th century itself, forbidding non-Muslims from wearing certain items of clothing. Yeah, so that's a long discussion, of course, that I won't detain our viewers with, because it would really take a long time to discuss. Anyway, so sumptuary laws and interventions to regulate clothing are in no sense new in the Republican period, but the focus is and nor are they exclusive to women. I mean, I've already said in the Republican context in Turkey, and in fact in Iran as well, the first attempts to regulate clothing by modernizing regimes, or I should say secularizing regimes in the early 20th century, actually regulate men's clothing. Now, the Turkish anti-veiling campaigns, sporadic, highly localized, and not very widespread in the second half of the 1920s, essentially failed. And they're not restarted, as I said, until 1933, but especially 34 and 35. And although the model has already been set in the 1920s campaigns, what happens in the 1930s is also distinctive in a number of ways. In the 1930s, following on from the 1930 municipality law, municipalities kind of lead the charge in anti-veiling campaigns because they've been empowered to kind of mete out forms of punishment at their own discretion. So, for example, the issuing of fines against women who insist on covering their face, for example. This is something that's locally enforced. Although, again, central government is ambivalent and ambiguous, and sometimes sends out circulars, which can be interpreted in multiple ways, but occasionally criticizing local government for exceeding its brief by coercing women into abandoning veiling. So that kind of municipality law is part of this increasing turn towards statism and authoritarianism in the 1930s. Whereas in the 1920s, it had been provincial councils and provincial governors who'd kind of been the main forces behind these anti-veiling campaigns. And in the third chapter of the book, Adak stresses the diversity of local actors, including, of course, elected councils and municipalities, I should say.
In what sense elected?
I mean, elected by vote. And I should also point out that Adak ties this project of so-called women's emancipation in the 1930s to women's political mobilization by the Republic. So in 1934, for the first time, women in Turkey are given the right to vote and be elected to parliament, a right that many European women did not enjoy in the 1930s, of course. So it's kind of all of a piece. Now, Adak's book is a kind of revisionist intervention in a number of key respects. And this is discussed mostly in the introduction, but it's a theme that recurs themes that recur throughout the book, I should say. One is kind of complicating and nuancing this picture of center-periphery relations. As I've said a number of times, even in the 1930s, these campaigns were locally organized and they were shaped by local actors, and the center exercised quite superficial oversight. I mean, there was never a countrywide ban in Turkey, with the exception of a 1924 law that forbade school teachers in government schools from wearing the petfa or face veil. But there was never an attempt to ban women from wearing the veil countrywide. And even in cities like Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir, there was no such ban at all. For multiple reasons, partly because unveiling had made greater progress in these cities in the first place, but also because introducing a ban was seen as something that would harm the image of these cities, where by the end of the 1930s, veiling had become far less common. Largely not through discouraging women who were already veiled from veiling, but through inculcating the new generation with the norm that they should be dressed, that they should be unveiled. So, if you want to understand reluctance in the Muslim majority world, including in contexts like Egypt in the early 20th century, to permit a woman to attend school and so on in a public context. I mean, part of it is tied up with these things, with these kind of programmatic agendas of modernizing governments to basically socialize a new generation of girls and women, and also boys, of course, into largely or highly secularized norms in which Islam plays at most highly instrumentalized role, and has this inferior position as part of this national identity. That's also true in the Arab world, of course.
Yes, I mean, I wanted to actually ask specifically about how, I mean, this is slightly off topic with respect to the book, but maybe you can add a brief comment about analogous transformations in the Arab world, because I'm not aware of comparable attempts at anti-veiling campaigns in much of the Arab world, at least. Yet, the anecdotes that I hear, and you'll be familiar with the literature, speak of by the middle of the 20th century, veiling was extremely rare in major cities like Cairo.
I mean, to some extent. So that's a great question. This is tackled largely in chapter 5. I mean, we do have a fair amount of scholarship on unveiling of the Arab world, especially by scholars like Beth Barron, on whom I drew actually from my article as well. Now, and I mean, Layla Ahmed's frustrating but somewhat useful book, A Quiet Revolution, should also be mentioned in this regard. And that book made me frustrating. Well, I was about to say, although I've been on Hajj, Layla Ahmed is a scholar who makes me want to tear what's left of my hair out, because she belongs to this highly secularized elite. And if you read her memoir, the extent to which that elite is alienated from its own context is frankly revolting. So, her school teacher in this nationalist Nasserist context, at one point in Layla Ahmed's memoirs, berates her for not actually being able to speak Arabic. And bloody hell, you should be able to speak Arabic if you grow up in an Arab country and your parents are Arab. I mean, anyway. And Layla Ahmed has kind of internalized this self-hating rhetoric. But anyway, why is A Quiet Revolution a frustrating book? Because, although a very interesting and to some extent useful one, because you can see the cogs slowly turning in her brain, whereby she finally realizes that, wait a minute, in the last few decades, with the kind of so-called re-emergence of veiling, especially from the 1980s onwards, and I say so-called for reasons I should discuss. Well, in the 1980s, actually, veiling could be a symbol of women's empowerment, for example. It could allow them to engage in the public space, while, to some extent precluding criticism for engaging in the public space. Now, and in American college campuses, as discussed by Layla Ahmed, who took many decades to realize this, had she simply asked a Muslim woman who wore hijab on an American college campus, she may have taken less time to do so. But anyway, that's another story. It could, the reasons and the motivations one attaches to hijab, however one understands that terms, are diverse, and it can even be mobilized as a kind of, critique of materialism and consumerism, and a statement of women's, the fact that they should be judged by the content of their character, not by how they dress. So there are all kinds of diverse motivations and reasons and so on that has actually been explored in anthropological literature, not least in ethnographic literature. Of course, Adak does also refer to the complicating of the notion of women's agency in the work of figures like Saba Mahmoud. Anyway, the hijab in the early 20th, to return to your question, somewhat convoluted fashion, the word hijab in the early 20th century Arab world meant complete veiling, i.e. including covering of the face and the system of seclusion of women that accompanied it. This is what, for example, Nadira Zainuddin, the Lebanese Druze activist who wrote her Hijab was Sufur in 1928, which Adak says really kind of accelerated the debate in the Arab world. And attract.
Omar, do you mind repeating yourself, because your internet seems to have gone a bit silent, so if you don't mind just saying that.
Sure. So anyway, the 1928 Hijab was Sufur tract by Nadira Zainuddin, which really accelerated the debate in the Arab world. When she refers to hijab, that's what she's referring to: female seclusion and veiling, actual veiling of the face and so on. Now, when veiling re-emerged, and I put it in quotation marks advisedly, in the late 20th century, it was not the veiling of the early 20th century, and it wasn't seclusion either. Because for economic and political and ideological reasons, women's participation and visibility was far greater than what had been the case in the early 20th century across the Muslim majority world. Now, we're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about, in my case, my grandmother's generation, both of my grandmothers from both sides. Now, in the Arab world, there were no kind of anti-veiling campaigns in the way one sees in the Iran of Reza Shah or Ataturk's Turkey, or the Albania of King Zog and his successors, or 1928 in Afghanistan under King Amanullah. There were no such campaigns. And it's really interesting. When reading this book, I ended up, since Adak stresses the role that religious arguments played in unveiling, and I should stress, with few exceptions, like the communist republics, what these anti-veiling campaigns, whether in Iran or elsewhere, attacked, what they attacked was mostly face veiling. In Iran, also the wearing of the chador, which is not unlike the sharshaf, this kind of concealing garment covering the upper body and so on, that can be this argument, I should say, was widely adopted.
I'm going to stop you briefly, Omar, because your sound is really cutting out a lot. I don't know. I haven't heard you for the last 30 seconds properly. It's been cutting out. So I wonder if
you could give me a moment to restart in that case.
If maybe you like. Yeah, sure. Take a minute, if that's all right.
Sure.
Actually, I can hear you now.
You can perhaps reflect. All right. Okay. This is okay.
I think so. I mean, your video is still, but that's not quite as important.
Okay. In any case, viewers aren't missing much by not looking at my face, so I will continue to speak. So, one thing Adak mentions that I've reiterated is the fact that in the Turkish context, and even in other contexts, like Iran, one could say, I mean, even secularists did not openly attack the covering of the hair. And a key role was played by religious intellectuals, like Tawfiq Sidqi in a piece I revisited when reading this book, his 1910 article in Al-Manar, published by Rashid Rida, Hijab al-Mar'a fil Islam. What does he say there? And this argument, I should say, was articulated by modernists who, to be frank, share a great deal of the blame for what happened in subsequent decades. and it was widely adopted by modernizers and secularizers of all stripes, including those like the Kemalist elite, who in fact wanted women to uncover their hair as well, without stating it so frankly. Anyway, what was the argument? And Tawfiq Sidqi is a representative, as I say. Islam commands the covering of everything but the hands and face. However, veiling of the face has nothing to do with Islam and is a foreign custom adopted by Muslims from outsiders. He even uses the phrase, Islam is innocent of veiling. And the word used is, hijab is when people criticizing it in the Arab, in the early 20th century, they talked about hijab. Islam is innocent of veiling, as the wolf was innocent of the blood of Yusuf. This is the very kind of evocative phrase he uses. Now, Tawfiq Sidqi will have to answer before God for his crimes, so to speak, as will Rashid Rida for publishing this. Now, why do they make this argument? Neglecting the fact that in the earliest works of tafsir, long before, post-classical works of fiqh like Ibn Abidin, who suggested women are obligated to cover their face, for example. And by the way, that was as far as I can establish, consulting works like Ibn Abidin's Rad al-Muhtar, Dardir's Sharh al-Saghir, the Maliki work, or Sharh al-Kabir, rather, the works of Buhuti and Maradawi in the Hanbali madhab, and for the Shafi'is, the Egyptian al-Bajuri, all of these works make it very clear that women are, whether because of the corruption of their age or inherently, are required to cover their faces. So this is the standard opinion across Sunni schools in the late post-classical period, immediately before and into modernity. Now, that's the opinion you find defended by late Ottoman intellectuals like Kawthari in his Maqalat, and Mustafa Sabri. And Adak mentions the conservative religious periodical Sirati Mustaqim, even suggests unsuccessfully that the Sharshaf be made obligatory for women in the Ottoman Empire. But already after World War I, the women have begun to some extent to shed the veil. There's actually a really good biography by Irfan Orga, a portrait of the Turkish family, published by Eland Press, which is just a kind of biography of a guy who joins the Air Force in the 1930s or something. But he talks about his experiences and what unveiling actually looked like in Istanbul, in the second decade of the 20th century. I think his mother stops covering her hair or something like this, or stops covering her face perhaps, and local boys throw stones at her and things like this. You get this very granular account of what it looked like, but that transition accelerated massively in the early Republican period. So modernists kind of pioneered these arguments against veiling, ignoring the fact that veiling of the face is an opinion attributed in the earliest legal and tafsir literature to some of the companions, like Abdullah bin Mas'ud. Now, I would agree that in the earliest period, say the works in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century, veiling of the face does seem to be a minority view, but it comes to prevail very quickly. So I mentioned the example of Juwayni, who's Imam al-Shafi'i in al-Umm, does not suggest at all that women should cover their faces. But this critique is instrumentalized by secularists who then use it as a battering ram against late Sunni traditionalists to say women should uncover their faces. Go on.
Can you just re-articulate very briefly Tawfiq Sidqi's sort of argument, because I unfortunately was a bit distracted momentarily.
Sure.
But you were saying that, so he basically said that his argument was against the face veil, not necessarily against the hijab as a whole, right?
Yeah, and even Nadira Zainuddin makes the same. And by the way, Qasim Amin in Tahrir al-Mara makes the same argument.
So
their argument is simply that women are not required to cover their face. They're not required to cover their faces, but they take that one step further now, because even figures like al-Albani would argue vociferously that women are not obligated to cover their faces. The difference is he would not then say, as Tawfiq Sidqi and Nadira Zainuddin and other modernists would say, that the face veil is a foreign imposition that has nothing to do with Islam.
Yeah,
that position,
it's mustahab or something like this. This is
precisely. That's in the title of Albani's book. That's made explicit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, but in fact, that argument is made, and it's curious that although in most contexts, barring extreme cases like the Soviet republics, Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan have been analyzed in some detail, barring those contexts, in public discourse, covering of the hair is not actually attacked, even in the context of very serious, sustained, although highly local and locally colored campaigns against veiling in Turkey in the 1930s. People are not attacking covering the hair. So, because is generally the case that people are covering their head in any case. Men after 1925, like Ataturk, might be wearing Panama hats. Again, the height of self-hatred. And the irony, of course, being that the fez, when it was introduced to the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s, was actually introduced as a kind of form of modern dress, but so closely associated that it become with Muslim identity and the visibility of Muslim identity that it's derided as a sign of backwardness and Oriental, depravity or something. Although my paternal grandfather continued to wear it, as it was quite common in the Arab world, certainly into the end of the late 1950s. It was just fairly normal. I mean, and I should say in the Arab world, because you didn't have these campaigns, even if you might have some level of tacit encouragement to unveil. Adak says, for instance, even in the 1940s, veiling was common among Muslim women in Beirut, veiling of the face. For example, in Egypt, by the end of the 1930s, in cities like Cairo, covering of the face had become very uncommon indeed. But through their socialization through modern state school system, and also through propaganda and social pressure, and so on, the kind of veiling also had class, and even now to some extent has a kind of class connotation in a space like Egypt, as one 18th century European source attributes this proverb to the Ottomans, although many cultures it's attributed to, a fish begins to rot at the head, a phenomenon that is true of the Muslim majority world, because it's always the so-called elites who are the most heavily westernized, and the Iranian context, and I'll finish with this before kind of returning to Usama. In the Iranian context, it's very, very unclear whether there was actually an attempt, an official law prohibiting the chador and the face veil. People speak of the 1937, I think, or 1936 Kashfi hijab rule. However, there's debate about whether this actually happened or not, and part of that confusion is a result of the fact that the Reza Shah himself and the royal family and the court elites played a key role in popularizing Western dress, essentially, and this expectation that women be dressed like Europeans.
Right.
So that kind of has partly produced this confusion among even contemporaneous European observers in Turkey and Iran.
Right.
Yeah.
SubhanAllah, there's so many dimensions to this, and I have a bit of a cough. I wish I could ask far more detailed questions, but inshallah, let me sort of just go back to a comment you made, which I found rather striking, actually. You said, Tawfiq Sidqi and Rashid Rida will have to answer for what they've done. I mean, and from what I can tell, what you were mentioning in terms of what they've done is simply to, I mean, Rashid Rida, I don't know what his motivations are, obviously, for giving someone a platform, because this is something that
I should say he published pieces of Sidqi that he disagreed with, most notably his views on hadith.
Yeah, and so in that regard, Rashid Rida is trying to sort of, I guess, facilitate discussion, including with interlocutors he disagrees with, which I think is quite a noble practice, personally.
I agree, but you're also, you cannot forget the context. I mean, if you're living in Republican Turkey in the 1920s and 30s, and the civil law has just been totally secularized in 1926,
right.
and the script has been changed from Arabic to Latin,
right.
and the stuff is being shoved down people's throats. In that context, you have to be naive to the point of stupidity, perhaps less so in the Arab context, to jump on the bandwagon. Even if it's and the best, you have to be aware of the ways in which what you say can be instrumentalized. I mean, you've got a moral responsibility to be aware of that. Now, of course, saying it's not obligatory is one thing. Saying it has nothing to do with the religion, ignoring all of these early sources is another claim entirely. Right. And someone who makes the latter claim is really lending themselves to appropriation by secularizing elites who, at most pay lip service to Islam as a religious identity.
SubhanAllah. I mean, yeah, it's because the other comment you made about, I think it's true. The post-classical tradition overwhelmingly thinks about sort of the niqab as being an obligation, but I also think back to someone like Marian Katz's comments in her book.
But yeah, I mean, but in the case of veiling, the face specifically, it's far earlier, as I've tried to emphasize, in the post-classical period. You find it, in the 5th and 4th Islamic centuries, and even if jurists will say things like, "Oh, this isn't part of her aura," however, she's obligated to cover her face anyway. Yeah. Now that's really important, because that's the space where you can deploy this facade as a man argument, as jurists overwhelmingly seem to have done.
But this is, also something which Marian seems to have kind of problematized to a certain extent. And the question is, to what extent do we adopt that as a paradigm? Because the Fasad al-Zaman argument is kind of critiqued by kind of modernist ulama like Yusuf al-Qaradawi as well, who are on the, he has a book called, short essay called, the veil is neither, sorry, it's neither a bid'ah nor a wajib, for example, meaning the face veil. And, people like that are sympathetic to the view that we don't need to advocate the face veil, although he actually also points out, if someone is particularly beautiful, it's encouraged for her to wear the face veil. I don't think he says it's a wajib, if I recall correctly. Yeah. So, I sort of wonder, it's one of those areas, this is like obviously major culture war territory within the West as well.
But I should stress again, that view Qaradawi advocates is not at all what Sidqi is saying.
Okay, yeah.
And Qaradawi is also saying,
vilifying
the... I mean, Nadira Zainuddin is literally calling the face veil a bid'ah.
Okay. Right.
I mean, and that's what modernist intellectuals are doing in the early 20s. And of course, Qaradawi is speaking in an entirely different context, kind of post-1980s, especially, where women have entered the public space, the workforce and state schooling in massive numbers. And the veiling they adopt, of course, is radically dissimilar from and the context, and also, even in terms of the actual garments used. So
I apologize to viewers if the sound quality is sort of poor. Unfortunately, Omar, your sound has been cutting out for the last, I want to say, 10 seconds now. So if you could maybe wait a moment and then repeat yourself. So it's still, I can't hear you. I also am conscious of the time, and I don't want to sort of but unfortunately, I couldn't hear you. And
of course.
okay, so yeah, inshallah, if you like, I can hear you now, and I can see you clearly as well. But
Sure.
if you want, you
Okay.
can repeat yourself, and then we can perhaps conclude by
Sure.
addressing a question of a viewer, inshallah.
Sure. Okay. I mean, I'm very sorry that the author of this. We've been experiencing ongoing issues for various reasons. Anyway, the form of veiling Adak mentions that emerges in Turkey in the late 20th century is actually entirely in keeping with, Kemalist anti-veiling campaigns, in the sense that, that form of veiling would not have violated the norms of the Kemalist anti-veiling campaigns of the 1930s. Why? Because almost entirely, or you do find exceptions to this even today, but women are kind of wearing a European style overcoat, for example, with a headscarf, and that does not fall foul of these anti-veiling campaigns, or even the prohibitions. And the appendix of the book, I should mention, discusses in concrete terms in different municipalities and localities, when did they issue a ban on which garments, and so on. I haven't said enough about women's agency.
Do you want to take a couple of minutes? I mean, if that's,
yeah. So I mean, that's one of the major contributions of the book, of course, right, which I really enjoyed reading. I mean, it was frustrating for reasons that had nothing to do with the author, and for reasons that have probably emerged in the course of this episode. But the book is a fantastic read, and there is still not. I'm with the example of Camp's book on Uzbekistan and this edited volume, which explores a range of contexts. There really just isn't enough scholarship on veiling, especially from my perspective, the intellectual dimension of the debate. So how, in Islamic legal terms, what were the arguments actually being made? So women's agency, now that's another key thing, because Adak complicates and nuances not just the center-periphery relationship,
right,
but also the sense whereby women are dichotomously either active supporters or passive victims. Actually, in response to the anti-veiling campaigns, what we see is a rich spectrum encompassing everything from these kind of two poles, including strategies of selective appropriation and adaptation, which could mean, for example, covering one's hair with a European hat or headscarf,
right,
or using the umbrella, or in some cases continuing to wear the peta and being fined for it, and so on. And of course, women did also exploit the new opportunities and the visibility and opportunities for participation afforded to them by these changes. Now, an earlier generation of scholars had emphasized the emancipatory nature of these changes. Beginning in the 1980s in Turkey, you have feminist critiques of these Kemalist reforms that recognized the supposed achievements. I mean, in terms of visibility and participation in public life and so on, recognizing the achievements while criticizing a still deeply patriarchal, Adak mentions a patriarchal consensus, because it's not that the Republican elites wanted their women to be, they were also interested in the control of women's bodies and sexuality, just in a different form than, had been the case in the late empire. So women did also afford themselves of these opportunities to participate in public life.
Right.
And in some cases, in some localities, were actually key to the articulation of the need for anti-veiling campaigns. Although, for example, I mean, although one finds mixed attitudes, so the Turkish Women's Union, I believe, is founded in 1924. And in that, in the 1920s, they are saying things like the Sharshaf does not impede one from participating in public life.
Right.
Although the kind of image one gets from women's activists does seem to change, especially in the 1930s,
Right.
as indeed it does across the region. Now, if I could say something about the difference between Turkey, Iran, and Albania, I've already spoken a bit about the Arab world, of course. The kind of key difference I've alluded to already is the Turkish state was already quite highly centralized compared with these other two nations, and enjoyed a much greater degree of penetration into society. Of course, one thing that Adak stresses is that we mustn't see the state and society as dichotomous, and she adopts this approach other scholars have used called the state in society. There's a kind of feedback loop and certain amount of reciprocity. It's not a unidirectional question of unidirectional influence. But that greater penetration also means that there was greater agreement in the Turkish context and also greater reluctance to employ coercion. So these things all seemingly linked. Whereas in Albania, you have a first attempt to ban the face veil officially in 1929. This does not seem to have worked. So in 1937, the ban is restated, targeting the face veil specifically in this case, with a fine not exceeding 500 golden francs to be imposed on violators. So the Albanian context is far more authoritarian, but one expects also much less successful because political authority is far more fragmented in the Albanian context in the 1930s than is true of Republican Turkey. So I've alluded to some of the changes. Right. And part of that increased authoritarianism and statism in the Turkish context is the introduction of new institutions like inspector generals of the Republican People's Party in the 1930s. Taking I suppose, a leaf from the Stalinist playbook. Sorry, and also the introduction of local associations like the Turkish Hearth. And other related organizations, which are kind of sites for socialization and political mobilization in these local contexts. So what we get in this book ultimately is a highly textured, very well and richly documented account of some of the intellectual arguments against veiling as they develop and emerge in the late Ottoman context and are embraced already by people affiliated with the Committee for Union and Progress, and then the early development of anti-veiling campaigns in the second half of the 1920s, their emergence in the mid-1930s in, again, still localized but much more widespread in the form of organized anti-veiling campaigns, usually relinquishing from the use of coercion, but largely propagandistic in nature. And then an account, an account that throughout emphasizes the highly local nature of these processes and mechanisms of enforcement, as well as women's agency. And then in the final chapter, a comparison between the Turkish and other Muslim majority contexts. So it's a work I highly recommend to readers. Frustrating at times for reasons that the author, of course, are not at all the fault of the author and have more to do with the baggage that I carry. And it's very lucidly written and is a fairly quick read, but a well-evidenced series of arguments.
Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. Really fantastic sort of overview of the book and an opportunity really to get into some of the meat of it in extensive discussion. We have one question proper. We do have Black Viper, our regular, saying, Assalamu alaikum, gonna have to listen to this one on replay. Glad to see you back, Dr. Omar. But we have one question, question directed at you, which you have perhaps touched on, but maybe would be good to directly address. How important did secularist regimes find it to find ex post facto religious justifications for anti-veiling policies? And perhaps not ex post facto, but how did they instrumentalize arguments that were being made?
Yeah, they found these extremely important, according to Adak, not least based on how frequently they reiterated these arguments. Even though they were, Taha Hussein and Ataturk, by the way, are both known to have said this or written it, that in terms of modernization for them and westernization were the same thing. And they both said we must adopt, and they used the same diction, right? They said, or the same metaphor rather, we must, have not just the rose, but its thorns as well. So, they both of the, and, God resurrect them with each other. But, the kind of underlying logic is very much the same. And if you want to convince, and you're not going to use coercive measures because those haven't proven very successful, and they couldn't even inspire rebellions, as in some cases they do minor rebellions. In the case of Albania in the 1930s, one minor rebellion is quickly suppressed, and some violent incidents in the Turkish Republican context. I mean, if you can't adopt coercion, you have to persuade people, and religious arguments still have obviously a huge amount, but diminishing currency in the early Turkish Republic. And if people are coming under a great amount of pressure to unveil, to some extent, it's a sort of salve for their conscience, a balm for their conscience, to be able to say, well, look, this respected religious intellectual says I don't have to veil my face, for example. But in terms of how important it was to these authoritarian regimes, the answer is extremely, and this is reflected by how frequently they reference these arguments. Now, did they do so disingenuously? You bet you, but that doesn't mean these arguments didn't still have impact. In context like Central Asia, something Marianne Camp stresses in her book, and I think in almost every case, it's not authoritarian secularists who are the first ones to articulate these arguments, and it's definitely the case that they're not the most, or their versions of these arguments are the most important and influential. Actually, it's the Jadids in Central Asia and the circle associated with El Manar in Egypt and the Levant and so on. These are the people who are going around saying this argument. And these are the people whose argument has traction. Now, one thing I'm still unable to understand, given the nature of this propaganda, the fact that they refrain in almost all of these contexts from explicitly attacking, covering of the hair. Why is it that what's being attacked is veiling of the face, and yet by the mid-20th century, covering of the hair also disappears in urban spaces among most classes of women? Yeah. That is probably just more something to do with the general atmosphere of westernization. Now, one interesting thing is, of course, the dynamic of unveiling varies from context to context, even within national contexts. And Iran and Turkey and Afghanistan were never colonized as Adak says, in contexts where, in fact, Western and European powers did colonize. It was much easier to wield the argument that unveiling equals westernization. And people did, in fact, wield such an argument. So unveiling happened, for example, more rapidly in Turkey than it did in most of the Arab world.
Right.
So that's an interesting point. But so much work, I think, especially in the Arab context that I'm more familiar with, so much more work remains to be done, especially on the intellectual dimension of this development on unveiling.
As always, a good book will raise as many questions as it answers. And, I think our discussion illustrates that it does also raise some very interesting questions that we will be exploring going forward into the future, inshallah. But I really must thank you, Omar, for giving us nearly an hour and a half of your time to reflect on Sevgi Adak's clearly wonderful book. And we thank, I guess, first and foremost, the author for writing a book, writing it in such an accessible fashion, and we'd recommend people to try and get their hands on it, published by IB Tauris, which is under Bloomsbury now. And inshallah, we look forward to welcoming you in a week's time as well. We'd like to thank all our viewers, including the people who put in their questions. And we'd like to encourage you to join next week when we discuss Oliver Schaprot's book on Muhammad Abdu, which has the title Muhammad Abdu, and the subtitle is Modern Islam and the Culture of Ambiguity. So Oliver is, of course, a friend of both of us, and someone who was on the Brace Council. I'm not sure if he's still on the Brace Council, but the British Association for Islamic Studies. So someone with whom we've worked closely in the past. So very much looking forward to that. But Omar, I don't know if you want to say anything else, or
Sure, just to apologize to the author and the viewers for the occasional issues with my sound, although Usama, you picked this up very promptly, so hopefully not too much was lost.
And I'll edit, inshallah, I'll edit the video to cut out those sections so that it's a bit smoother. We are working with certain limitations because Omar is now in the Middle East where maybe the internet isn't as reliable at times. So let's see what we can do about that, inshallah. But please bear with us, and inshallah, overall, I hope that this is as rewarding experience for all of you as it is for me listening to Omar's wonderful insights. Jazakumullah khairan, Omar, and look forward to seeing you in a week's time, bi'idhnillah, along with all our viewers. And with that, we say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.